spread and present new ways to interfere with political processes and influence public opinion. Now, very often, if you were to listen in on the mainstream media, the charges of disinformation fly back and forth. Those who are slightly leaning to the left, or perhaps leaning very much to the left, accuse those on the right of sowing disinformation and misinformation. And the same is returned to them in equal volume. And we must admit, especially those of us who live here in the United States, watching MSNBC and watching Fox is surreal, because they're often describing the same event, but with totally different interpretations of what you're supposed to be seeing. And what this is leading to, as you can see over the last week, is instances of very dangerous political violence, instances of deep mistrust in institutions, and perhaps even sowing the seeds for post-election violence and crisis. But we do not have to go down this way. Change is possible. Inequality, polarization, and division are not inevitable. At Pathfinders, we focus on analyzing the problem and also on finding solutions. Our inequality and exclusion team have been convening dialogues and producing new research to counter polarization and bridge divides for the last 2 years, and have brought together these findings in a new report titled Uncovering Strategic Division and the Linkages Between Polarization and Inequality. So this morning, I am very much hoping that this high-level meeting will offer us not only a chance to admire the problem, as we so often do here around the UN, but also to find and suggest solutions that we can all rally around so that we can succeed in advancing SDG16 plus. Now, we don't have much time, and so I'm going to have to do something that is harder to do across the road, which is to place limits on how much we can talk. And so each of you, I think, has been respectfully requested to keep your remarks to 5 minutes. If you see me fidgeting, at first in a very subtle and polite way, and in an increasingly agitated way, just know you have 1 minute to wrap up. My fidgeting will have to do with me lifting a piece of paper a little bit, not aimed at you, but generally waving around, and you'll notice it. So our first speaker is His Excellency Mr. Petr Hladík, Minister of Environment from Czechia. Czechia, one of the sponsoring countries of this event, and a very strong supporter of our Pathfinders initiative. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, there are participants in this group and online also. It's my honor to take the floor on behalf of Czechia, co-chair country in the Pathfinders Global Alliance Against Inequality and Exclusion. I would like to thank the organizers for preparing today's discussion with the excellent speakers. Czechia is pleased to co-sponsor this event together with Canada and Bangladesh, and I'm glad that we have a full room during the busy program of the high-level political forum. Ladies and gentlemen, it's too many cases. Disinformation campaigns seek to divide our society and weaken public institutions. Data-driven attack SDG16. In this context, allow me to share a few insights from Czechia. Again, according to our data, only 42% of the general public finds it easy to identify disinformation. More than half citizens consider disinformation a serious problem. In recent years, various crises have led to increased radicalizations and declines in trust in democratic institutions. We have seen this during the migration crisis in Europe, the COVID pandemic, and now the Russian aggression against Ukraine. What is striking is the misinformation and disinformation, online hate speech, and incidents of physical violence have disproportionate effect on society. For example, women and girls are more likely to be affected by cyber violence. Disinformation also undermines our efforts to tackle climate change. The existence of climate change has negative impacts has been provided by scientists many, many times. But we can still hear a voice questioning the need for climate action. So what we can do about it? In the case of climate change, we believe that an evidence-based approach is crucial for raising awareness and supporting impactful political actions. To give you one specific example, we have made a website called Facts on Climate, published news and concrete data that are easy to understand. It also informs about the work of Czech Environment Information Agency and the Czech Hydrometeorological Institute. More generally, we are focusing on the social institutions of marginalized communities and on education. Czechia has also adopted a robust legal and policy framework aimed at promoting equality, combining discrimination and upholding human rights. Improving SDG16 simply cannot happen without addressing two root causes of inequalities. Ladies and gentlemen, the Pathfinders really point out where it's not a single solution to this challenge. I believe that we can see this fact as an opportunity to learn from each other and look forward to cooperate in tackling polarization and disinformation in pursuit of SDG16. And Pathfinders, even such as this one of may very well serve this purpose. Once again, many thanks organizers, and I wish us all an inspiring discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your remarks, Minister. And of course, one of the things I always appreciate from your country is the path that you've chosen from freedom, embracing of democracy, and advancing the people's voice. I think we have a lot to learn from you in this regard. I next have the great privilege to call Her Excellency Ms. Kenyeh Barlay, Minister of Planning and Economic Development of Sierra Leone. She is one of the co-chairs of Pathfinders Alliance Against Inequality and Exclusion, and we are delighted to have her with us today. Welcome.
Thank you, moderator. Good morning, everyone. We didn't always timer, but maybe I don't. I thought I had 3 minutes. So, but since I have 5, but what I would do, I made a mistake. I thought I had more time and I was talking slowly. And I could have finished in time. I think it takes 15 seconds. Anyway, good morning to all of you. And yes, I do acknowledge that I am the co-chair of Alliance Against Inequality and Exclusion, also the chair of the G7 Plus, as well as the Minister of Planning and Economic Development. And I'm happy to speak here about the risks there are in addressing inequalities, especially in fragile and conflict countries. We all know that inequalities are key drivers of conflicts globally. The principle of leaving no one behind will not be achieved if inequalities persist. Now, given the limited time available, I would like to address polarization and inequality together. Some of the issues we have already mentioned that I will highlight, we may go specifically into some examples of how we have addressed this in Sierra Leone. So polarization can result from inequalities and vice versa. Inequalities should and must be addressed if we are to make meaningful progress in realizing SDGs, as well, in the years leading up to the completion of the 2030 agreement. However, the current poly crisis and multiple other factors pose a serious threat or serious threats to increasing inequalities, especially in countries in fragile situations and on a global level as well. And some of these include exclusion and the unequal distribution of resources. This contributes to inequalities and limits access to resources and social services for certain groups. And this has led to polarization. Other areas that we can address under the economic polarization is debt distress, which limits the ability of governments to support social safety nets and other inequalities. Climate crisis affecting everyone. Climate change affects everyone, but it disproportionately impacts vulnerable populations and income communities. Escalating conflicts. You have the conflicts that lead to polarization leading to further conflicts, pandemics as well, that we have dealt with in the past. So this thing we have to live with COVID now. But we hope that we don't have other major pandemics, but probably was a major polarizing. You also have the social polarization, which is segregations within society that emerge and lead to income inequality, or you're polarized because you're much poorer. Cost of living affects the bottom, those at the bottom of income distribution. Let me know when I have to do that. And then you have those living in poorer and remote communities. Youths in a number of countries feel marginalized. Women are marginalized, but they're not such a high risk group as youths. Youths, when they're marginalized, they tend to react. There's a saying that we mentioned, I mentioned at another meeting, a hungry man is a kind man. And somebody asked me, well, what about a hungry woman? A hungry woman is less dangerous. She'll go out and buy food for her family, but the man will react more conflict. Political polarization that you have mentioned in our countries, in the US, distrust between citizens and government, societal fragmentation because of the social media, other governance issues. Governance issues are also mentioned in some of the polarizing rhetoric. Various political groups. So for Sierra Leone, we have opted to adopt an inclusive approach that ensures citizens have full participation in the development process. We have adopted strategies that ensure that societal challenges are addressed in an amicable manner. For example, the tripartite committee for cross-party dialogue in the aftermath of the 2023 elections in Sierra Leone. And the report of that committee is just being submitted to the president. We also have an active progressive legislation that has increased women's participation. This is the Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment Act, which increased female representation in Parliament and Cabinet for Parliament 15 to 28%. I almost, okay, 15, and then cabinet ministers from 10 to 30%. Suppose I'm part of that 30%. But the other thing, and this hasn't been enacted, is that we have a more youthful cabinet, including youth in government. Our youngest minister is 32. I might be the oldest minister. Our chief minister is 36. And we've got at least 30% of the ministers that are under 40. So, you know, that also, we also have a radical inclusion policy for education, getting vulnerable groups, ensuring that we have universal education, ensuring that vulnerable groups are part of the education system. Also, vulnerable groups have greater access to health. But, and we also have set up an independent commission for peace and national security. However, limited financial resources pose serious progressive inequalities. This is an issue we need to address so that we can continue to make progress. And we need to consider these issues amongst all of our states, because it's critical, as I said, to address inequalities. We need strategies for societies to work together to address our governance and economic challenges. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your remarks. And that quite remarkable statistic about the youthful cabinet of Sierra Leone, which I always notice when, including yourself, when ministers come from Sierra Leone here, they're always very young, forward-looking, and in a continent with such a large proportion of young people, I think Sierra Leone's cabinet looks like a population. And I think that's to the great,
Youngest cabinet.
it's probably in the world. Probably in the world. Well, next I have the privilege to call on His Excellency, Mr. Akhter Hossain, who is a principal coordinator for SDGs at the Prime Minister's office in Bangladesh, and which is one of the co-sponsoring countries for this event. Mr. Hossain.
Thank you. Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum and a very good morning to you all. Let me start by paying homage to our father of the nation, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, who in his maiden speech delivered at the UNGA in 1974 mentioned the Bengali nation is dedicated to building such a world order in which will be reflected people's desire for achieving peace and justice. SDG16 aims to promote peaceful and inclusive societies, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. One of the significant challenges to achieve the objectives of SDG16 is the prevalence of polarization and disinformation. These issues undermine democratic process, fuel conflict, and erode trust in institutions. Furthermore, they challenge the effectiveness and accountability of institutions by spreading false narratives that can influence public opinion and policy decisions. Addressing polarization and disinformation requires a multifaceted approach involving governments, civil society, media, and international bodies. Essential strategies include promoting media literacy through school curricula, public awareness campaigns, and community programs to help individuals critically evaluate information sources and recognize disinformation. Enhancing regulatory frameworks can hold digital platforms accountable for the spread of disinformation. This includes transparency requirements for algorithms, content moderation policies, and measures to combat the proliferation of fake accounts. Policies must be carefully designed to protect freedom of expression while addressing the harm caused by disinformation. Media literacy programs are essential to equip citizens with the skills to critically evaluate information sources, recognize disinformation, and make informed decisions. Public awareness campaigns can highlight the dangers of disinformation and provide tips on how to identify credible sources. Supporting independent and investigative journalism is crucial for providing accurate and unbiased information. Strategies that work in one context may not be effective in another. Efforts to address polarization and disinformation must be tailored to the specific cultural, social, and political contexts of different societies. Policies that address economic and social inequalities can reduce the root causes of polarization. This includes equitable access to education, healthcare, and employment opportunities. Community building initiatives such as cultural exchange programs and collaborative community projects can strengthen social bonds and reduce divisions. Creating a resilient information ecosystem requires collaboration among governments, tech companies, and civil society. Investing in AI and machine learning can enhance defenses against disinformation campaigns. Polarization and disinformation are global challenges needing international cooperation. The evolving digital landscape demands continuous innovation to counter new disinformation methods. Implementing comprehensive strategies to tackle these issues requires significant resources and adaptation to stay ahead of disinformation campaigns. International cooperation and multi-stakeholder engagement are critical for sharing resources, best practices, and developing coordinated responses. By working together, we can create a more informed, cohesive, and just world where SDG16 can be fully realized. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your remarks. Next, I have the privilege to call on His Excellency Mr. Hugo García, Vice Minister for Strategic Analysis for Development from Guatemala, which is one of the countries sponsoring this event. Welcome.
Good morning, Moderator, Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, and dear friends. I hope everyone is having a peaceful, just and inclusive day. I appreciate the invitation to this space to discuss effective inclusive development strategies that contribute to reducing social and political divisions or polarizations. Thank you to the Center for International Cooperation of New York University for organizing a cross-regional event. First, allow me to say how pleased we are to be part of the Pathfinders for Peaceful, Just and Inclusive Societies in 2017, when it was a much smaller initiative, then led by Brazil, Sierra Leone, and Switzerland. We appreciate how the interest in SDG16 has grown globally. We need to keep the momentum going. We think that divergence in views is good for society and democracy. It provides diversity of views, which we should always celebrate and embrace. But this is based on the premise that those different viewpoints are honest and constructive. Today, we are seeing divisions carrying a lot of hate and malintent. In Guatemala, we are in our third year of government led by President Bernardo Arevalo. The electoral process and our first months in office has shown the deep divisions in the country, and one of our biggest challenges is precisely to achieve more unity and heal historic wounds. In general, we think we have lost the ability to listen to one another and the dialogue. The ability to resolve conflicts through peaceful contestation is a measure of any well-ordered society. We need more dialogue in our countries at the local and national level on all issues. We need people to think and debate about matters of public policy. We think more dialogue will lead to more understanding, and if we add some trust and little empathy, we can learn to grow together. In Guatemala, we have aligned our national development plans with the Sustainable Development Goals. Allow me to speak what we are doing on SDG16. First, we are making important efforts to strengthen public institutions and democratic security. with the objective of guarantees that all Guatemalans can achieve personal, family, and social development in an environment of peace, freedom, and democracy, respecting and promoting all human rights through the rule of law. There cannot be sustainable development without peace, and no peace without sustainable development. One of the 10 axes of our General Government Policy 2024-2028 labeled Democratic Security in a Country to Live establishes the strategic guidelines that will guide over the next 4 years the joint work of public institutions, international cooperation, and other actors with the aim of promoting a peaceful and inclusive society with access to justice. The goal is to lay firm foundations to build a state under which a rule of law is observed and applied without distinction of class, religion, gender, ethnicity, or any other variables. A state in which no one is above the law and in which there is no tolerance for impunity. By doing this, the state promotes relationships that incentivize associativity and cooperation based on the common good and avoid criminalizing organizations or leaders that seek the well-being of their territories and peoples, including indigenous population. In this context, one of the state's main commitments is to guarantee the respect and protection of human rights for all by ensuring equal access to justice, especially for population in vulnerable situations. To do this, it is necessary to have solid institutions to contribute to institutional and political stability and educated public servants who demonstrate effectiveness and transparency in their decisions. In addition, it is necessary to promote active citizen participation in conversation on governance as a measure to recovering the credibility and the legitimacy of public sector's actions. We are aware that the social responsibility of all sectors is fundamental for social audit and transparency. In this sense, we believe that it is essential to promote actions to strengthen civil society and its capacity to perform this audit role, thus contributing to the consolidation of institutions that guarantee justice. Given this state commitment, the international community has played a strategic role in the country as an invaluable partner of Guatemalan population in the defense of democracy and against authoritarian threats that seek to weaken our democratic traditions. Guatemala joins the global dialogue, recognizing that achieving the SDGs require a structural transformation that includes the participation of all social actors as an essential strategy to achieve significant results in achieving peace, justice, and solid institutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your remarks. Some of you will notice me on my mobile phone. I'm not checking my mail. I'm actually tweeting some of what our contributors say. And I'd encourage you, if you're on your phone and checking some quick mail, just throw out a tweet supporting this event and perhaps some of the brilliant thoughts you're hearing from our participants. Well, under SDG16, Symphony will tell us in a second. Pardon? Yeah, so NYU CIC or SDG, hashtag SDG16. Yes. Nowadays, if it's not on social media, it actually didn't happen. This is the problem. Next, I have the privilege to call an old friend of mine, Under Secretary General and Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide, Alice Wairimu Derito, who has really been sounding the alarm all over the world, the risks of polarization and disinformation that, given their escalation, can reach very far in terms of the harms that they can cause. And that's what you tell us. The floor is yours to listen to.
Thank you very much. And I begin by thanking you, Ambassador Martin Kimani, and the New York University Center on International Cooperation for this invitation. And I have 3 questions to answer, and I'll move very quickly through them. And what does hate speech look like today? I would say it looks like a space in which we haven't tackled polarization and disinformation, and understanding the way in which these phenomena are related and connected with hate speech that can lead to incitement and to discrimination, hostility, and violence, and even incitement to genocide. And in my role as spiritual advisor on the prevention of genocide, I'm mandated to monitor, to raise the alarm, and alert the Secretary General of situations where there's a risk of genocide or related crimes, by which I mean war crimes and crimes against humanity. So much of what we do on a daily basis is very intricate, and that's conducting risk assessment and comprehensive analysis of the risk factors and indicators, and to understand the concept and dynamics of these crimes, paying attention to the early stages of violence. So one of the key risk factors that my office monitors is hate speech, any segment of discrimination, hostility, or violence on the basis of identity. So we often emphasize that no country in the world is immune to hate speech, and no country in the world is immune to genocide either. And in 2019, the Secretary General Antonio Guterres launched a strategy and plan of action on hate speech, and asked that our office takes the leadership in its implementation. And why he did so was because hate speech is both an indicator, but also a trigger to risk factors of genocide. And we do not have a single genocide that has ever been perpetrated in the world that was not preceded by, accompanied by, and followed by hate speech. And when I'm speaking about hate speech, I'm speaking about hate speech as regards what meets the threshold of incitement to violence. So, you know, there's lots of language that people get away with that doesn't reach the threshold of incitement to violence. So we do know that stopping future genocide and related crimes from ever happening needs to be rooted in early warning to trigger swift action for early prevention. And often we forget, many people do not realize how few options we have when a genocide is actually occurring or about to occur, when the power is with the people with the weapons, and that we have many more options in terms of prevention before it happens. So the earlier we identify risks and trends, the earlier we can act and halt harmful narratives, violence, and escalation of conflict. And we've seen in past instances of genocide how harmful narratives and hate speech build the pathway to violence and serious crimes against certain individuals and groups based on their identity. So in terms of this first question, hate speech continues to promote discrimination and hatred, incite violence, and fuel polarization and conflict around the world. And patriotic narratives are still widespread and widely disseminated through the internet, various communications tools and platforms, and social media. Algorithms are further shaping, directing, and limiting conflict exposure of individual and group users, which shape the way they see, interpret, and react to the realities and perceptions of reality around them, creating this environment for polarization and for the dissemination of hate speech. And this can have massive implications when building and fostering peaceful communities and promoting respect for diversity. And I do believe that we are yet to grasp the impact of artificial intelligence in that context, including with the development of AI-generated content from text to images and even videos. We've been having problems with capturing the videos, especially on YouTube. The hate speech is quite something there. So at the same time, we have to remember that offline hate speech remains dangerous and alive. I always say that people need to remember that before we had the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, before we had the genocide in Srebrenica against the Bosnian Muslims, before we had the Holocaust, that we actually had hate speech. Hitler had a minister of propaganda called Goebbels, Joseph Goebbels. That was a minister in charge of hate speech, and that was all before social media. When the Tutsi were being labeled as cockroaches, that was all before social media. And yet, how come the entire population that went on to kill them knew that these people can be referred to as cockroaches, therefore so dehumanized that if we kill them, then we can get away with it? So we should never ignore offline hate speech and concentrate always on just on online hate speech. So we say all this before the inception of technological tools available today, pointing to the pernicious consequences of offline hate speech, which continues to permeate today's society. So for the second question, focusing on the danger of pitting groups against each other, we know that hate speech and the dehumanization of communities on the basis of their identity helps with discrimination and exclusion, which if not addressed can lead to violence including genocide and related crimes. So these are the risks of identity-based harmful narratives that aim to further exclude and turn communities against each other. And these risks are very, very much present in 2024, as we all know. So it is important in this context of the ever-growing spread of misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech to understand the nuances between these elements to be able to adequately monitor, analyze, and address them. So to better understand the convergence and differences between hate speech, misinformation, and disinformation, just last week, we published a research paper in partnership with the UN Department of Peace Operations, and which we can share with you so that everybody can have access to it. So I'd like to speak to the last question, the third question. And we focused quite a bit as like part of what the UN has, the capacity the UN has is convening, but also creating policy. And so we've created a huge number of policies around the issue of hate speech. So first we have the strategy and plan of action that I spoke about. We have another strategy which we worked on with tech and social media companies with whom we've been having conversations for many, many years, long before other people are having conversations with them about hate speech. We helped them to put together algorithms as early as 3 years ago or before. We helped them to put together training for content moderators. We've kept expanding our base initially, and I remember being invited by Ambassador Martin Kimani to brief the Security Council, and we came with the social media companies, Twitter, TikTok, Facebook then. And now we've really expanded our base. So we have the small ones, we have Discord, we have Twitch, we have Slack, all those. And there's so much that's happening there that's completely people get away with. And so we've done policies with sports people, we've done policies with women, we've done quite a number of policies. But I would like to emphasize the role that socialization plays. We often underplay the role of socialization. Thinking about when a child is born, and a child is born without hate, and then that child gets out into the world, and then where the influence comes in terms of hate, thinking about how do we interrupt those influences coming in from playmates, coming in from schools, coming in from parents. What is it that needs to be done to interrupt those spaces? And if we don't interrupt, we know that that child actually then begins to become an implementer of what that child has been taught. So there is, of course, the big role of ensuring that the children are exposed to as many diverse people as possible, so that when they are forming opinions on how people should look like or behave like, they are thinking about somebody that they actually know, like a friend of theirs. And beyond that, for member states to take action through a multi-sectoral holistic approach and address the impact, root causes and drivers of hate speech, especially root causes. Where does it come from? When people dehumanize others, when stereotypes build into prejudices and then into hate speech, why don't we address the stereotypes that then became the prejudices and then became the hate speech? That we need to absolutely do. So we need to invest in research to understand hate speech trends, because that hasn't been done enough. We need to promote education on the dangers of hate. We need to strengthen digital literacy and media and information literacy. We need to reinforce the capacity of relevant actors and ensure that all sectors of government have the tools needed to respond. We also must, extremely important, support victims of hate speech and promote positive messages to counter hate speech anywhere. So as the UN focal point on hate speech, so we are completely prepared as an office to support you in all efforts to address and counter hate speech, including to develop comprehensive national strategies. We have UN country teams developing UN country team strategies, but now we've moved into the countries also developing national action plans on hate speech. And it began with Kenya. Kenya was the first country to develop a national action plan on hate speech. And the next country was Costa Rica. And actually this week on Friday morning, we have an event with the permanent representative of Costa Rica and the resident coordinator of Costa Rica. And they will be showcasing how 6 ministers of the Costa Rican government sat together and organized the drafting of the country's first national action plan on hate speech. So finally, I would say again that hate speech is alive and with us, and most often people do not see the consequences. People see they're happening now, people link it to elections and think that after elections this will be over. it will not be over. There's a whole generation of young people who are being born now and who are being influenced by the rhetoric on TV and in other social media spaces, and that will shape their opinion. And in future, they'll be the implementers of hate speech. They'll be the ones propagating hate speech, and in the worst case scenario, they'll be the perpetrators of genocide. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Undersecretary General. I wanted to just, if you don't mind me mentioning two things in relation to what you say and your role. One is that when we imagine free speech and civic conversation, and we think of the demos where in our first political science class or history class, you see a few Greeks standing by a column somewhere discussing what should happen to Athens. That's what we think of. But when you think of today's demos, today's civic space, free speech operates, your free speech goes into an algorithm. The algorithm decides where to direct it, how to direct it, and the pace at which to direct it. It targets it, and then it goes to someone else. So you actually don't have free speech directly between you and the person you're trying to talk to. You have free speech between you and the algorithm. Then the algorithm takes your speech and gives it to another person's right of listening to speech. And it does that to maximize profit and engagement. So when your democracy and your civic space has a man, woman in the middle called an algorithm that is driven by motivations that are very different from democratic protection or upholding of free speech, but rather increasing engagement and earning profit from that engagement, we have to question the very infrastructure of democratic speech and free speech today. And I think when Sasha begins, she's done a lot of work on this, she'll, I'm sure, be able to pick some of those points up. I don't want to intersperse myself too much in this conversation, but I'm going to have to say something in USG that I think bears mentioning, which is that you yourself have had to endure a tremendous amount of polarizing hate speech, misinformation, and disinformation, as so many actors try and influence you and your team's analysis of events, your pronouncements, and the decisions that arise from that at the United Nations. I think you have been remarkable in having the stamina and the courage to endure what must be an unbearable storm of voice directed at you and the team. So I think we all owe you recognition for the role that you're playing, an understanding of the incredible difficulty you and your team have to find truth and fact in the midst of deliberate organized misinformation and disinformation. And to really hope that the United Nations as a whole creates the systems that enable its officials to be better protected and to be better able to do their jobs without disinformation and misinformation. Now, the next speaker is a colleague of yours. Is he coming? I think we can move forward, and when they come back, you can take up the floor and to invite Mr. Christian Law, Director of Development and Open Societies of the United Kingdom, who's the head of the delegation of the HLPF. Thank you for being here, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And actually, before I speak, let me echo your last words, because I think we're all fighting for the same things, but some of us are more exposed than others and are feeling the impact and the attacks on a day-to-day basis, and just to recognize that. But I thought just to start off with, it would be good just to remind ourselves of some of the facts and figures in terms of the state of the world before we talk about what the actions could look like. Last year was the 18th consecutive year in which global freedom has declined. Last year was also the year in which the average level of democracy enjoyed by individuals around the world has fallen back to what it was in 1985. And last year was also the year that saw 59 conflicts. And of course, conflict is probably the most extreme form of polarization that you can think of. And then finally, 71% of the world's population nowadays lives in autocracies. And that is up from 48% just 10 years ago. So you can debate all of those trends and figures, but together they tell quite a powerful story of how the world has been changing and where it is going unless we work together to tackle some of the issues that are on the agenda today. And I think there's been a very rich conversation, so I will not repeat points that colleagues have already made, but I thought I would highlight three additional areas that we consider as really important dimension where action is required in this space in terms of tackling polarization and fragmentation. And the first one is maybe not the most obvious one, but it's about delivery. Because at the heart of what we see in many places, there's effectively a breakdown in the contract between citizens and their government, citizens and their leaders, a breakdown in trust. And that's because aspirations, expectations haven't been met. And so there's a lot that we're discussing at the conversations here in terms of the high-level political forum, in terms of the SDGs, and the lack of progress there, and the lack of delivery that we need to catch up on. But of course, for many people, it's their governments, it's their local leadership and their local administrations where that is most felt. So this point of lack of delivery leading to unequal outcomes and inequality, leading to polarization, is something that is at the heart of what we're talking about here. The second dimension is around accountability and transparency. And we often jump quickly to the conclusion of elections and democratic processes. But I want to highlight one other dimension here, which is actually about tackling corruption and illicit finance, which is a key element that hasn't been mentioned, in the sense that the people who benefit from the polarization, the people who benefit from some of those conflicts, often make good money out of it. And the people who don't deliver and get to power without rising to the expectations that we have placed in them also often benefit personally. And it's fair to say that I think for the UK, this has been an uncomfortable spot for many years because of the fact that with one of the biggest global financial centers, a lot of that money, one way or another, transfers through London. And there's been a huge effort over the last few years, and definitely Russia's attack on Ukraine has accelerated that effort to close down those loopholes through economic crime and transparency legislation, to improving the transparency of actually who owns what, and then to take measures against people who actually you don't want to have investments in your country, and where you don't want those corporate structures to be registered with you. So that element really is an important one as well when it comes to tackling accountability and transparency. And then the third and last area that I wanted to mention in the space of tackling disinformation is actually around the fact that together we need to do a lot to protect the plurality of voices in our own countries, but then also in the countries with whom we have partnerships. And what we see, of course, is that some voices get louder, and that voices sometimes get louder by using false information. But at the same time, there's often a very active effort to shut down other voices. And the efforts here, where we are putting increasing emphasis, is around actually supporting and standing up for people who are speaking. Whether those are journalists, whether those are human rights defenders, but then also not just for individuals, but working together to have the systems and the structures to protect people more generally. And that is about the importance, for example, of a free and independent media. And that is about people having the ability to have strong representation through civil society organizations to protect in numbers. So that space around the plurality of voices is a third area that I think I would like to highlight as part of the organizations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your enlightening remarks. Our Special Secretary General, Special Envoy on environment technology is not a fact. So we'll keep moving forward, and when we return, we'll give it the floor. I would now like to open the expert panel discussion, starting with Ms. Onia Rees, Executive Director of the Edelman Barometer. And really, we're very curious to know that based on your research and years of experience with the Edelman Barometer, what key trends you spot in trust, polarization, and disinformation, and how does distrust impact critical areas like climate change action and health? And what do you think are the solutions that we should be looking to? Ms. Rees?
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. I'm honored to be here with this really distinguished panel. I am the leader of the Edelman Trust Barometer, which is one of the largest social science surveys in the world. We survey 28 countries. We do multiple studies a year now. We've been studying trust for over 25 years. So I'm going to share a few findings from the last couple of years of research to help provide a framework and some context for how to think about polarization, the impacts, and some possible solutions. In 2023, January 2023, our report focused on the topic of polarization. And we measured polarization by the extent to which people feel that their country is very or extremely divided, and they lack any optimism that those divisions can be overcome, right? Those divisions are entrenched. We found that there were 6 countries that were severely divided, and another 9 that were in the danger zone. 2 months after we fielded the survey, one of those 9 countries, Brazil, saw an attempt to overthrow an election result through violence, through storming of government capitals, right? So these signals the danger of polarization and how they can lead to violence and political unrest are very, very real. Almost 2/3 of our respondents globally in the 28 countries that we surveyed told us that they feel the level of instability and the lack of mutual respect in their country is the worst that they have ever seen. And 62% say the social fabric that once held their nation together is now too weak to be a foundation for common purpose. Right, so that lack of unity leaves us unable to address problems, solve challenges, and it leaves us feeling vulnerable. It especially leaves us feeling vulnerable to those who, as some have already said, are going to exploit those divisions, right? So who do we think is exploiting that division? Greatest response, 62%, the rich and the powerful, right? The elite, those who are profiting from our division. Not far behind, hostile foreign governments, right? So there's a fear of foreign interference in our election systems, in our information infrastructure that is shared by the general population. Third, our own government leaders, right? Politicians who are exploiting our differences for votes. And unfortunately, journalists also are seen as being today more divisive and unifying. On the positive side, right, who do we see as unifiers? Teachers. Number one, 64% say that teachers are more likely to be unifiers than dividers. Leaders of NGOs, civic society, and by a smaller margin, but still remarkable, right, business leaders. 41% say business leaders are unifiers, 32% say they're dividers. So a 9-point positive advantage for business. And this is important, as you'll see in a moment, because of the major societal institutions that we measure, government, media, NGOs, business is the most trusted of those institutions, right? And the way that you can understand that, and people often are surprised, and it was surprising to us as well, because for the first 20 or so years of the trust barometers, it was NGOs that were being trusted, right? And then about 4 or 5 years ago, business caught up and is now the most trusted. Why is that, right? What is trust about? trust can be understood to be combined of, can you get things done, right? Do you have competence? Do you have ability? And do you have integrity? Can I trust you to do what is right, right? Do you have a shared sense of purpose, a sense of fairness, right? All of those ethical components, right? And where business has always been the most competent institutions, 53 points more competent than government, right? But in the last 3-4 years has actually seen a very significant increase in its score on ethics, right? So now seen almost as ethical as NGOs, which are disadvantaged on the competence scale, right? So there's something happening where business leaders, in spite of the role of the rich and powerful in sowing the vision, still have some credibility and some ability to perhaps move things in a positive direction in collaboration with other institutions. But let's talk about some of the impact of polarization very quickly first. I mentioned we can't solve our problems, right? Climate change, nuclear war, 77% are concerned about both, right? Foreign conflicts leading to nuclear war. And those fears and concerns are higher than my personal fears. I fear over my own personal safety or my income or my job loss, right? So we have big existential fears. We had a survey that we conducted this May in 13 countries. There's a fear that was even higher than climate change and nuclear war. And that was the fear of election outcomes, bringing into power people who are going to threaten me and our country. Think about that, right? People are more worried right now about the result of elections being damaging than they are even of climate change and nuclear war. So there's a deep fear, sense of concern and unease about democracy and how that's going. We're also turning inward more, right? We're more concerned about foreign countries not having our interests. We're boycotting foreign brands. We don't trust other countries with their strategies around climate change, right? And that the majority of countries distrust each other to do what is right on climate change. And these impacts are not only broad and societal, they're also personal. We found this year in this health study that we did that 41% of young people say they're choosing doctors based on politics, right? If I find out that a doctor is not aligned with my political beliefs, I will not trust their advice and I will stop seeing them. Wow. Okay, that is a sure signal that ideology and identity have become merged in a way that perhaps is too extreme for civic conversation. So what are the drivers? What's underneath? Many of them have already been mentioned by our speakers. The largest drivers of polarization or predictors of someone feeling polarized: distrust in government, a lack of shared identity with my nation or my community being the strongest drivers. Underneath that, next in strength, systemic unfairness. And then also contributing smaller amounts, economic pessimism, right? A lack of sense of economic opportunity and distrust in the media. The mass class divide is stunning, right? And it has been broadening and it is showing up in very serious ways when we measure trust. High income respondents in the top 25% have been growing in trust over the last 10, 15 years. And the majority of them trust their institutions. System is working just fine for me. If you're in the bottom 25% of income, you have been distrusting and you have stayed distrusting. So the gap between the two, right, as trust has risen among high income, but has stayed low among the low income, has continued to grow. And it really expresses so many of the other inequalities and systemic injustices. So a path forward, right? What are some thoughts? The role of the institutions relative to each other is one that we really have to think about. And there's right now a big imbalance, right? Government is deeply distrusted. The media is distrusted. So that leaves NGOs, it leaves business to carry far more of the weight than they should, right? How can they do that in a way that is authentic and perhaps helps to bring more trust to the other institution. We saw a 12-point rise over the last 10 years in the expectation that business collaborate with government, right? So contrary to some of the anti-regulation and conversations and so on that are happening, people generally say, no, we need some of that confidence that business brings to the table. We need the innovation that business brings to the table, but it needs to be tempered in terms of managing the impact through a strong collaboration with government. So good out there. We have to, number two, restore economic optimism. And we have to do it in very meaningful ways. We have to address the concerns of vulnerable communities, of youth. We have to explain to people how their jobs are going to be impacted, how they can navigate changing technologies. What does the future of work look like? In a world characterized by AI and automation, and how do we bring that sense of optimism that actually is stronger right now in the developing world back into developed countries as well, so that people feel again openness to collaboration, both within their country and globally. We have to fight for the truth. Others are going to speak to that more than I can. But one last thought I want to leave you with, which is the role of local communities when it comes to trust, right? Right now, at a time that we do not trust other countries, institutions, societal leaders, again and again in our research, what it tells us is the people we trust are the people we know. They're the people in my community. They are teachers, they are pharmacists, they are religious leaders, they are community leaders. And we need to find a way to empower, activate, support those voices, and to do that at scale. And I'm hoping that's the conversation from here. Shed some light on how to do that.
Thank you very much for your insights. I'd like to welcome Ms. Sasha Hladík, co-founder and CEO of the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, who is a great leader in this work, and I think who a significant extent has been a leader in shedding light on this particular challenge for years now. What trends are you seeing in polarization and extremism, and what strategies have you identified that can counter weaponized hatred and disinformation?
Ambassador Kimani, it's wonderful to see you again. It's an honor to be here with everybody on this extremely important topic. Disinformation is, of course, as old as time. So really the question is, what's happened? What's changed? What is going on that's got us to where we are today, which feels certainly more polarized, and the data, of course, has shown it, and also to some extent more prone on violence than ever before. And I'll focus, because I've got very little time, on two things. One are the profound changes in our information technologies and environment that you've pointed to yourself. And I'll start with that. And then some of the changes that we've seen tactically in the way in which malign actors are organizing. Social media. We talk about this a lot. It isn't just that there are relatively small numbers, and I will say they are relatively small, committed malign actors, conspiracists, extremists, hate mongers, authoritarian states increasingly, now able to reach further and faster than ever before to push their agendas, or sometimes commercial actors even piggybacking off of that to make a buck. But it's also that they have disproportionate impact now because, on the one hand, the platforms are really systematically failing to enforce their own rules, their own terms of service. And this is getting worse. It's also worse outside of the English-speaking world. And it's worse because they're cutting their trust and safety teams, and they are actually closing off data access to independent researchers that would bring to light some of this type of activity in a way as to prevent it. And so even things like the commitment to labeling disinformation, where we found, that sort of thing missing in over 50% of the cases that we've analyzed around crises, like, for instance, this weekend's attempted assassination on former President Trump. So in fact, we find ourselves now in a situation where we are significantly less capable to do the detection and exposure work that we've done in the past than before. And that's at a time where we're facing, I think, greater dangers. To add insult to injury, the platform's own algorithmic systems, as you've pointed out, designed to hold your attention as long as possible to sell you stuff, hypercharge, and our research shows this in a number of ways, designed to hypercharge whatever comes closest to the red line, serving up some of the potentially most dangerous content to the most vulnerable audiences, and exponentially amplifying, disproportionately amplifying extreme and sensationalist content. And malign actors know how to game these systems. And so, we found everything from Holocaust denial to misogynist to white supremacist to public health disinformation to climate disinformation, scam, conspiracy content being served up by the platform's own recommender algorithms and systems. And so often what you get is the outpacing of good content, if you like, by bad content. And that, as you've rightly said, is not a free speech environment. It's a curated speech environment where the attention economy prioritizes money, engagement over safety. And often, of course, we see the most vulnerable constituencies worst impacted, and generative AI and its sort of use and spread online is going to exponentially raise the stakes on this. And we're already seeing all of our bad actors quite effectively deploy on that front. But of course, it's not all down to social media. And what we have seen as well is this increased mutual coalescing and reinforcement of a range of malign actors, from authoritarian states to conspiracy actors to hate and extremist movements across the ideological spectrum, whose interests we see increasingly aligning around the undermining, actually, of rights, of human rights, and of liberal democratic norms. And they are very effectively borrowing from each other's playbooks and toolkits. There's plenty of evidence to show that, and often authoritarian states now piggybacking off of domestic hate and conspiracy networks very effectively, targeting wedge issues on a very opportunistic basis, which is why we see the same sets of accounts often pivot, exploit everything from race and gender debates to public health to climate to conflict and crisis in order to further polarize. And we've seen that, from jumping, if you like, these accounts of jumping from COVID and vaccine disinfo to Ukraine to Gaza and so on. And it's worth noting that these types of bad actors are motivated exponentially. Of course, they are early adopters of these types of technologies. And we tend to be behind the curve in responding. What do we do? Just three things I will say. I think we need to, number one, obviously a whole of society approach is necessary. I think good for us to start to organize our thinking in terms of addressing, if you like, the supply side of the problem and the demand side of the problem. If you like to think about this as working across the life cycle of disinformation, from production to distribution to consumption. And on the supply side, like with every economic and technological revolution, you have to find new modes of governance. And here we believe very much that the incentives and disincentives need to be changed for farm online. We're starting to see that with legislation coming into play in Europe and in some other markets, the Digital Services Act, ultimately transparency-based legislation or transparency-based approaches, where authoritarian states look to counter these problems through harsh controls and censorship. We need to shine a spotlight of transparency on these problems to bring them to public attention. Data access is absolutely required for that. We don't have it now. It's being shut. So we need better data access and sharing of data on the threat and on the ways in which these technopolistic giants are building and designing their technologies to amplify the problem. On the demand side of consumption, and I will say we've been heavily sort of inspired to some extent by the data that has just been presented by Edelman, the Trust Barometer, I think is really important to look at. There's an absolute need to scale bottom-up responses, trust-building responses. We're trying to do that, particularly with cities, with locales. Our Strong Cities network is really about community building the human infrastructure of trust at a local level to help us prevent the impact of this kind of disinformation coming at us in all of these sort of virtual environments. That's important. We also believe in scaling digital literacy, not just for kids, but also for adults. This is a major gap today. And in part because of the Edelman data on confidence in employers, in business leaders, we launched work with businesses. The Business Council for Democracy in Germany is now working with over 100 major employers, businesses, to deliver digital literacy to adults. We all have a role to play. These things need scaling. There's a lot of small things that need scaling. And finally, I would just say, we're at a stage now where we really need the upskilling of all of our institutions, beyond our publics, our institutions, law enforcement, courts. They often don't have the competencies to address illegality online, to support victims well. We're not well enough training media to report responsibly on disinformation, on activity in a way that doesn't propel further disinformation. We have a learning job to be done across society beyond what I believe needs to be better legislation and governance of social media.
Thank you so much for those insights. I'd like to now invite Mr. Mandeep Tiwana, Chief Program Officer at Civicus, who has been a long-standing partner of Pathfinders, to delve into Civicus' work and its global network of members who are working to strengthen citizen action and civil society. What are the trends towards authoritarianism that are impacting democratic institutions globally? And how are anti-rights movements connected to the rollback of rights?
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you to Center for International Cooperation and to all the state partners here for organizing this very important conversation. So I just wanted to put it out there that SDG16 includes commitments on responsive, inclusive, participatory, and representative decision-making at all levels. It also includes a commitment on access to information and protection of fundamental freedoms. So these are what might be taken to be civic space. And in our work at Civicus, we measure civic space through a participatory research platform called the Civicus Monitor, along with 20 organizations around the world, to look at how freedoms of expression, association, and peaceful assembly are protected in different countries. And those are very important because civic space provides an enabling environment for civil society organizations. And civil society organizations that are committed to social justice, to human rights values, as we know, promote social cohesion. They promote the rights of the excluded people. They include their work. They ensure that policymaking leaves no one behind, as promised by Agenda 2030 of the Sustainable Development Goals. So in our findings, we see that 85% of the world's population live in countries where civic freedoms or civic participation is restricted and repressed and closed in many, many instances. And this is a huge challenge. This means civil society organizations cannot do their job. So when you speak truth to power, when you expose wrongdoing, you're subjected to persecution. And 30% of the world's population actually live in countries where there is no civic space, absolutely closed civic space. So if you criticize those who hold power, if you criticize the government, if you criticize the people who are politically well connected, or if you come out with protests on the streets, or you try to publish a report that might be critical of those of a political party or a political establishment, you could be thrown into prison, you could be forced to go into exile, and you could even be killed. And that is a challenge. So one part of the polarization and discrimination agenda is that we have a number of states that are actively seeking, despite the commitments in SDG16, to delink democracy from development. Now, we thought that the argument for the rights-based approach was settled once and for all in Agenda 2030 or the Sustainable Development Goals. We made a shift from the Millennium Development Goals, which were a set of 8 goals, which didn't have a rights-based approach to Agenda 2030. But yet, there are significant mindsets that remain, what I would say is MDG mindsets continue to persist in how we are viewing development. So that's one challenge, a part of the problem. But the second problem, which speakers before have alluded to, is the problem of disinformation and how information is manufactured, how information is controlled, and how information is consumed by people. So you have 30% of the world's population living in these states. Here, there's complete state control. So there's just one sort of information, and the state provides that, sends that information to people. But then you have another challenge where in almost every country of the world, we are seeing people with extensive business interests in politics and people in politics coming in, having extensive business interests. So there's a tight overlap between political and economic elite that is there. Whether you look at Credit Suisse's report, whether you look at the Forbes billionaires list, whether you look at Oxfam's annual report, the number of billionaires across the world are continuing to grow. So this means that there is something that is happening in how information is manufactured and how information is consumed. And you can look at any country on the map and you will see that the major business companies, who owns them. So it'll be a few very wealthy people who will be owning those media houses where there is not full complete state control. And they are the ones who then also, along with tech companies, who profit from the algorithms that you spoke about earlier. So this is leading to an information manipulation for populations around the world, and which now, if you link it to the rise in authoritarianism, but the rise in right-wing populism, you have an explosive formula, basically, where you have a group of leaders coming into power who basically want to talk about a culture in their countries as static. They go back to a previous time where there was a so-called golden age, but culture has always changed, where there was homogeneity in societies. We know society has never been homogeneous. Migration is the huge story of humanity. People have always moved, but they go back and they speak to us about a certain time when everything was perfect, and they want to take us back to that time. And then they promote ethno-nationalist agendas. And once they come to power, then they start to consolidate and other populations. So they start to other minority populations, refugee populations, historically disadvantaged groups, religious and ethnic minorities, and so on. And oftentimes they also use patriarchal norms. So women human rights defenders, indigenous people's rights defenders, land rights activists are oftentimes attacked. And this is also another challenge which comes in how the right to peaceful protest. So when people come out on the streets, the only way when people are frustrated because of the economic system not delivering, they come out onto the streets. And if you look at most protests have actually happened because of the economic deprivation that people have felt. But when we have this media, which is controlled by a few people, that media then others, those people who come out on the streets, they call them anarchists, they call them all sorts of names, and it leads to greater polarization in societies and leads to more challenges. And that's how what movements, anti-rights movements are gaining ground, that are trying to reverse the gains made by civil society, whether on sexual and reproductive freedom, whether on human rights and social justice norms, which are being sought to be reversed. So how do we? What are the solutions? I just want to just offer. So one is Agenda 2030 provides us with a comprehensive, holistic, interdependent agenda. Now, SDG16 is being reviewed at this high-level political forum, but only 36 countries are actually participating in the HLPF. So countries have chosen which of the SDGs they seek to advance, which are their favorite SDGs, the ones that they cherry pick, the ones they think they can support. So we really need to see the SDG framework as a holistic and independent agenda, and that's one part that's critical. Second, countries in the global north also need to embrace the universality of Agenda 2030 and report on their own progress that they are making, and oftentimes that is lacking. And the other thing I would just like to also say is about civil society. So there's a lot of distrust that's been sown by civil society, and perceptions are also shaped by trust. So I would also just want to say that businesses spend a lot of time in public relations machineries, and that might be contributing to how people consume information and how they may be more receptive to certain things. Because when we know that there are certain challenges, we have global arms spending, which is almost $2 trillion, which is also fueling global conflicts around the world. So there are challenges with certain businesses. We have an acceleration of fossil fuel extraction, which is taking place in many parts of the world. Businesses are involved in those extractions. We also have other businesses engaging in corrupt practices in many states. So we just need to also engage with how information is being consumed and how it's leading to greater polarization of societies. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your insight. Now we are at 11:26, and I'm at a minimum responsible for 10 of those minutes. I'm so sorry, but it means that we don't have much time left. So I'll ask the rest of the speakers quite unfairly to please be as disciplined as possible to keep to the time limit. I'd like now to invite Professor John Powell from my favorite state, California, who's the founding director of the Othering and Belonging Institute at the University of California, Berkeley. Professor Powell, what are the key drivers and impacts of polarization? How can we shift away from these trends? And what do you mean by targeted universalism? The floor is yours.
Thank you. It's a delight to be here, and I've already feel like much has been covered, and I've already learned a lot. So obviously, can't really address these important questions in 4 or 5 minutes. So I'm going to cheat a little bit. Here's a book I just wrote called "Belonging Without Othering" with my colleagues Stephen and Indian. And I think that's the goal. How do we create belonging without othering? So what's driving this? And a number of speakers have noted that the polarization, I prefer the term.
You need the volume 3 out. It's much of the volume.
Okay.
Go ahead, Professor. Yeah.
That the concept of polarization and fragmentation is increasing. The democracy is on the retreat. The question is why and what can be done about it in some sense. And we talked about conflict entrepreneurs, people who are benefiting from it, so I'm not going to touch on that. What I will say is that there's change that's happening at an increased speed that creates anxiety in people. And these changes in critical areas include technology, climate, demographics, and others, the economy. Demographics we could think of as the spin-off of the change. And we haven't talked about demographics. So think about this. We hear every day, every week, that the world population is actually imploding. 70% of the countries already are either flat or declining population. And at the same time, you look at playbook, authoritarian leaders, they're organized around the other. They're organized around oftentimes immigrant. So on one hand, we're saying countries need people because of declining population birth. But on the other hand, we're pushing people away. So the other is what's being defined. The other is being weaponized. So the stories that the autocratic leaders involve themselves in the stories of purity and the threat of the other. The other is being weaponized. That story, we need a different story, right? We need a story where we have a larger we. We need a story that invites multiple pluralistic societies and make it real. We don't have that story right now. So the other is not just seen as different. He, she, they is seen as a threat. And we have not done a good job of that. And some of our work, even around dealing with social justice, we actually create a zero-sum game. We say there are winners and losers. We often say the dominant group needs to give up stuff so that the marginal group can advance. That's a zero-sum game. That's a mistake. Everyone is feeling anxiety. We need a story and a practice where everyone can grow. That's what targeted universalism leans into. So targeted universalism doesn't just look at the difference between a favorite group and a less favorite group. It looks at what every community needs to provide, independent of any particular group. So what's the universal goal? What should all groups have? Now, to get there, we will need different strategies. So that's where the targeted part comes in. The goal is universal. Strategy is targeted based on how we're situated. So different groups will need different strategies, not because of their race or their gender or their sexual orientation, but because they're situated differently in society and in relationships that you need to go. So that's targeted universalism. So what I'm suggesting is that the speed of change is actually creating anxiety in people, and then they turn to leaders to make sense of that anxiety. And they give them a story. And the story is not necessarily factual. Meaning is not about facts. People need meaning. I'll end by saying this. Good news is what's driving a lot of this polarization, fragmentation, is people's fear. It's people's fear of the future, which is one reason they result to the past. But beneath that fear is the desire to belong. People want and need to belong. And we need to create systems, structures, stories, narratives that say to people, not only does that other group belong, but you belong. And we can have a world where we all belong. And so I think that's the push. We need a different approach where everyone can belong. We're not pitting people against each other. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Powell, for your remarks. And we shall certainly be looking out for that book, which strikes me as being extremely important to my own country, how to belong without other. Next is Ms. Luz Meli Reyes, who is a journalist in Venezuela and co-founder of Efecto Ocuyo. She has come from Washington, D.C. to join us today, and we highly appreciate her being here. Dear Luz, how do recent media trends impact societies and human rights? And what effective strategies do we have to combat disinformation, polarization, from where you sit?
Thank you very much. And it's an honor to me to be here. Oh, I would like to say something that makes everybody laugh because everything is like a tension here. But I'm coming from the future, as you described and everybody described here. We used to say in Venezuela that we are coming from the future, and that future is a country which we're in a polarization situation, and now with a very strong authoritarianism. I'm sorry. And some of the things that we have discovered, we can share, it's a small contribution. I have a good news. The polarization finished. In some moment, it's going to finish. But I think the most important thing as a journalist that we have learned during this year is asking to ourselves why our country, in the case in Venezuela, were so polarized, were so divided, when the elite always say we are happy, and and we always asking to the people, we are really happy. Everybody was happy, and or we're happy. And what we have to realize is that the disconnection between the elite, the political elite, or maybe the business elite, and the real people that is suffering day to day in order to look for food, for education, make this kind of disconnection. And it's served for this kind of polarization leader to give some this kind of speech. As you describe, everybody here describe everything about what is happening. I would like to share something that begin the intervention, remembering that doing journalism is not a crime, but unfortunately, there are journalists who have been killed, imprisoned, and expelled for the country for doing journalism. This criminalization of the exercise of journalists present regimes that considering authoritarian, such as Nicaragua and Venezuela, other countries and in the region, such as Guatemala, what's happening in Guatemala, and Salvador, Mexico, Ecuador, even Colombia, and join the list of countries in which doing journalism has implication for physical integrity. As you say, Ambassador, when you were talking about how different is watching a TV channel and another TV channel about the same issue or the same situation, but with different approach. We live that kind of situation in Venezuela, and we used to say, okay, this kind, in our country, there are two countries. But what we think we found is there is not two countries, there are several countries. And I believe that is happening here in the state also. I would like to share some of our lessons. For example, working in a polarized and authoritarian context, and we realized that the polarization is a trap because it prevents us from focusing on issues that are vital for society and public debate, such as the debacle of the Venezuelan educational system, about, for example, Venezuela is the first country to run out of glaciers. And other issues are the activities of organized crime, which have combined with ecological crimes. And other situation is that a lot of more than 8 million of Venezuelans are leaving the country. When you are working in a polarized context, if you are only focused on the situation of the political situation or the polarization situation, you lost the focus of this kind of problem. And perhaps there is the complaint that people have with media or with the politics. I'm sorry, I have to finish. And the politics, because they feel that we are not covering the real situation. Something that we are doing is inform, educate, and be close to the community. And I forget to say that in Spanish, efecto capullo means firefly effect, which means that we try to be together with the communities and journalists and people bring light of information. And we think in our experience that try to work very close with community could help to not eliminate, but to reduce the polarization, the way that you are approached to the focus. Another experience that we try to share with everybody is how to listen to the people. Even that we are a journalist, we try to do some meetings with people having a coffee. In Spanish, we say guayoyo, which means a coffee, no American coffee, please. A soft coffee, a cafecito. And in this kind of environment, we can listen to each other and try to understand what are the audiences demanding for us for journalists. So I think that these kind of experiences have helped us to be here, for example, and to survive the most polarization age in our country. I have a news to share with you that in 28 we are going to have presidential elections, and I suggest to you that follow about the Venezuelan situation, because we are doing the experiment. As I said before, I didn't intervene with this conversation. We come from the future, and I think we are going to show you how is that future that we are working in. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your remarks and the work you do. And I'd like to now call on one of our colleagues from NYU family, Assistant Professor Dr. Daniel Rogers, who is at the NYU Center for Global Affairs and is a co-founder of the Global Disinformation Index. And we're very curious about your work and what solutions and strategies that you have spawned.
Thank you, Beth, for having me. I'll try to be brief. One of the disadvantages of going to the program is a lot of people have mentioned things that I was going to talk about, which could help, but talking about algorithms, hate speech, othering, profit and corruption, ethno-nationalism are all things that are front of mind for me these days. I think we all know at this point that our global information ecosystem is dominated by algorithms that profit, that promote hate, division, anger, fear, for profit. These are the kinds of emotions that drive engagement. Engagement drives ad sales, which drives profit, which drives the business models that are now some of the largest companies in history. And we're at the point in the history of the internet where over 2/3 of the world's population, their primary interaction with the world around them is through one of these algorithms, YouTube, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, etc. And those warpings of reality, those curations that are essentially funhouse mirrors, so to speak, are individualized to each person, and they're optimizing for these negative emotions. And now at that scale, there's the world's population. It's not actually surprising people can't agree on basic facts like the Earth is round or that vaccines, etc. And so first, I want to talk about an attempt to tie a lot of these things together. How I think about this information from a definition. We talk a lot about it, but I think we still have trouble pinning down what exactly is disinformation. It's not lying on the internet, right? Because if it was just lying on the internet, we'd all be clamoring to moderate every mention of Santa Claus off of Facebook. We're clearly not. And so, at the same time, there's a rather infamous website here in the United States that has an entire section called Illegal Immigrant Crime. And it's just a web page that curates local news stories about the crimes committed by undocumented immigrants. Each individual story probably fact checks to be correct. So you couldn't say that, they're explicitly lying on the internet, but by curating these individual stories into this page, putting it under this emotionally charged banner, they're essentially peddling a misleading narrative that in this case, undocumented immigrants disproportionately commit crimes, which is actually the reverse. And so from those two examples, we can try to weave together this idea that disinformation, or what I like to call adversarial narrative conflict, is this idea of peddling misleading narratives, often implicit, often crafted using decontextualized facts or combinations of facts and fiction, that more importantly are adversarial against an adversary group or institution, immigrants, medicine, science, etc. And most importantly, create a risk, right? The kind of content that leads to anti-immigrant violence, to harsh immigration policies, etc. And I think from there we can better understand why things like bigotry, hate speech, or ethno-nationalism fall under this adversarial narrative definition. These are the most adversarial of adversarial. And so to me, when you understand that most of the world's population is now interacting with the world through one of these algorithms that promotes disinformation, promotes adversarial narrative conflict, it's not surprising that most of the world, or more of the world, is suffering from ethno-nationalist trends than before. In fact, I would posit that ethno-nationalism is a direct byproduct, a direct externality of the toxic business model of algorithmically driven social media. And so, not to get too depressing, but it gets worse when you add generative AI. And so they've asked me to talk about trends. If you think about generative AI, now imagine the most dystopian version of TikTok, right? Right now, somebody puts a video on TikTok. TikTok's algorithm decides that it probably will help, attract you to their products, and they show it to you. Now imagine TikTok generating on the fly synthetic content based on their profile of each user that's designed to glue that user to their screen most effectively. there aren't any even trust and safety interventions because the content didn't exist before it was shown to that user. So these are the sorts of end states that this technology can ultimately lead to, which frankly is worse than where we are now. And so if you think about where we go from here, if we think about this problem as a byproduct of these toxic business models, obviously the solution becomes regulation. Using the power of democratic governments to push back against these all-powerful platforms, through regulation is the key. And so we see it in Europe through the GMA, PSA, et cetera. But here in the US, the fact that all of this tech reform work is stalled merely illustrates the power of these platforms and the need to push back. And so that to us is the key to the solution. We do work in attempting to change the business model structure, but ultimately the power is. So I'll leave it there. But clearly I've offended half.
Yeah, they thought you were giving them disinformation. Of course, you were not. No, we have the ministers, and they have,
of course,
11:45 is their hard closed. We only have two more speakers, and I think then we shut it down. We've run over. Next, I have Ms. Barlay McGee. I hope I've not murdered your name too much. President and CEO of Everyday Democracy, an organization based here in the United States that works with communities on the ground. And we're so curious about how strengthening local dialogue and participation can address declining trust and the alienation of so many fields of institutions.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you all, distinguished guests and friends. So the organization that I work with is called Everyday Democracy, and it's intendedly named that because we believe that all politics, that all democracy is local. We are the democracy. And so our work really focuses on how to build the capacity of everyday residents, citizens to work together to solve their local issues and challenges. That we're not reliant upon government institutions, though we are the institutions, right? We are not separate from those institutions to find solutions to answer our pressing issues. And so we do that by supporting local communities to organize dialogues that lead to a deliberative process and civic action. We are facing a challenge that could be as simple as how do you get a pothole filled in your neighborhood to how do we welcome new immigrants to our community in such a way that is reflective of the values we espouse as a nation. And so our work is really about ensuring that we host quality dialogue and deliberative processes that recognizes and attends to how power shows up in those spaces and rooms in a way that doesn't allow the pluralistic voices that we heard reference to, that disinformation and misinformation is actually addressed real time if someone brings a perspective that is not based in fact. We have something here in the States we called alternative facts. That is not a thing. They're just the facts. What happened is all that we have to really deal with. And so as we engage communities, and this can be community members that are parents that are trying to solve problems in their local school systems. It can be communities who have historically experienced disproportionate harm in policing, coming to look for solutions within the civic space and through civic discourse in order to address those issues. And so our purpose really is to recognize that truthful dialogue, honest dialogue, respectful dialogue, but also dialogue that recognizes that each and every person that arrives in that space is carrying a form of trauma in the experience that they've had before they have arrived.
So we heard about anxiety. What we haven't said in the context of America is that is white anxiety that is driven by an belief, a social and political belief in the rightful state of white dominant ideas and values that drive our nation. We're not all even having the same conversation about misinformation, polarization. What we know is that if we desire to be trusted as institutions, NGOs, media, and other forms of government, then we must be trustworthy. We must see and face the situation as they are and invite people into the process of exploring those realities and going from a fact-based conversation to devise a strategy for how we move forward. Government is not the problem. Government is the prize. Governance is our responsibility that we share jointly. And our work is about ensuring that people have the capacity, the skills, and the desire and courage to do so collectively. So that's our work.
Thank you so much for that. Welcome the last speaker we have for the day, who's joining us virtually from Indonesia, where it is already quite late. Thank you, Mrs. Alisa Wahid, founder of the Gusturian Network of Indonesia, for staying up late to contribute to this conversation. Mrs. Alisa Wahid has been an active part of the discussions that led to the report that we launched here at TSC. And what effective strategies do you think we can implement to combat the challenges we've been discussing this morning?
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Good day to you and to you all in the room, and good evening from from Indonesia. So I'll just go straight into the conversation. So the problem that we face in Indonesia is the first, of course, the spread of religious ultra-conservatism since early 2000.
Very hard to hear.
And then
Can you speak up?
Sorry, Mrs. Wahid, are you able to raise the volume as much as possible?
Or maybe remove your headphones.
Yeah.
Okay.
If you have headphones on, perhaps?
Yeah.
Okay. Is this better?
So much better.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So again, let me just go straight into the sharing. Thank you for inviting me to share with you the Indonesian experience. So what we face in Indonesia is actually we have a problem of religious ultra-conservatism, the rising of religious ultra-conservatism, but it also is intertwined with the decentralizations of governments in Indonesia in 1999. And then we also have the problem of, because Indonesia is a socio-centric society, then the politicians and the government tend to use social harmony as the ultimate framework instead of fulfilling human rights or constitutional rights. So with information technology and its effect on disinformation, then of course we have then the challenge of rising tensions between especially the majority versus the minority religious group. So the real challenge is actually majoritarianism in Indonesia. If you go to a district where you have, like, for example, in Bali, the majority is the Hindu, then the problem would be faced by the Catholic and the Muslims. Or in eastern part of Indonesia, it would be the Christian, the majority, and the challenge would be for the Muslim minority. And in the western part, it's vice versa. So that's the challenge. It's majoritarianism. It's not only ultra-conservatism. So the impact is decreasing trust, like all the all the speakers have already mentioned about, and violations of rights to religion. Who benefits? The politicians and the political entrepreneurs and the religious exclusivist group, and to a large extent, the majority in certain contexts, and vulnerable, of course, the religious minority. So what are the modalities that we have in Indonesia? We have a robust civil society. We have a moderate faith-based organizations that play a huge role in the lives of Indonesian, and we have the democratic foundations. So after the peak of this rising ultra-conservatism in the election of the governor of Jakarta in 2016, it was a wake-up call. The civil society raised to consolidate ourselves to challenge the rising ultra-conservatism. And then after a few years, the government come up with the religious moderation strengthening program. So the civil society, faith-based organization already coalesced. Gus Durian is the largest network of grassroots level communities in interfaith cooperation. So we were ready, and we supported the government's effort in this. So one of the speaker before talk about scaling up. This is what we're blessed with in Indonesia. The scaling up was provided by the government. So this way we have a massive, right now, currently we have the massive movement for strengthening religious moderation. And for the last 1.5 years, actually, index of public satisfaction for government performance is the highest for protecting diversity and promoting tolerance. So that's why in the last election this year, we see a decrease in religious sentiments, and we have a decreased incidence of intolerance cases all over Indonesia. So I hope that our experience in Indonesia can, at least give some fresh stories on how to combat these polarizations and divisive narratives. The key is a clear framework offered by the movement, and then the consolidation of network and proponents, and of course, creating container spaces for dialogue. That's the story from Indonesia. Thank you very much for allowing me to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that sharing. That really brings us to an end, and it feels like a dissatisfying end, because I think this conversation should have continued, and certainly would have loved to hear more from the audience. But time is a tyranny, and we unfortunately do not have any more of it. I'd just like to thank everybody who has shared their thoughts and their time with us. I have a summing up, but I really don't need to spend more than a minute on it. Everything I have heard today, from the trends against democracy, the rise of authoritarianism, the rise of weaponized AI and social media-driven hate speech and disinformation, and that weaponization being by organized actors, including states, makes me wonder whether we are actually living in the end times of government by the people and for the people. It appears that this is not merely a threat, but in fact powerful trends that run against the kind of democratic choice that we all value so much. And so it strikes me that everybody who has spoken is a soldier on the front lines of freedom of speech and of association, of dignity, democracy, and governments that are accountable to their citizens. They are young people all over the world fighting for the same goals. Some of them are fighting in my own country on the streets today. And I hope this conversation proceeds not coming back necessarily to talk about the trends as important as they are, but for us to come together to build alliances, to push back especially against the social media companies, the concentration of wealth and its interest in shaping our political lives. So thank you very much for participating, and I encourage all of you to look at the report by Raquel Jesse, who led the writing of the report, a wonderful report, titled Beyond the Rhetoric, Uncovering Strategic Division and the Interlinkages Between Polarization and Inequality. Thank you so much and have a good day.